Imagine waking up one morning to find a giant neon sign in your yard that says non-compliant property, placed there by a woman who doesn't even have authority over you. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to me when HOA Karen decided she owned the entire neighborhood, including my house, which wasn't even part of the HOA. From fake fines to trespassing on my property with a ruler to measure my grass, this woman was unhinged. But when she tried to take it to the next level, she had no idea who she was messing with. This is the insane, hilarious story of how I took down the most entitled HOA tyrant ever. And trust me, you don't want to miss the ending. Hello beautiful peoples, before we dive in, let me know, where are you watching this from? Tell us in the comments and help us to complete 1,000 subscriber. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. A place where people mowed their lawns, waved politely and minded their business. That was until Karen arrived. Karen wasn't just any HOA member. No, she was the self-appointed enforcer of the most ridiculous, imaginary rules ever. Clipboard in hand, she roamed the streets like a mall cop on a power trip. The problem? I didn't even belong to the HOA. But that didn't stop her from targeting me. It started small. A note on my door about my trash cans being visible from the street. Then a warning about the length of my grass, which according to Karen was offensive. The final straw? She tried to fine me for a garden gnome. Yes, a garden gnome. I laughed it off at first. After all, she had no real authority over me. But Karen didn't care about logic. She wanted control. And when I refused to comply with her made-up rules, she escalated. First it was passive-aggressive notes. Then the official-looking violations. Soon she was lurking, watching, waiting for me to slip up. She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, staring at my mailbox like it had personally insulted her. I knew this wasn't going to end until one of us backed down. And that was never going to be me. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was on a mission. A mission to make my life as difficult as possible, all in the name of a homeowners association I didn't even belong to. She took her self-appointed role so seriously that she might as well have had a badge and a siren. Every morning, like clockwork, she patrolled the street, clipboard in hand, searching for imaginary infractions. She would squint at houses like a detective solving a high-stakes crime, except the crimes were things like a car being parked an inch too far from the curb or a flower pot being too bold in color. One day, she marched up to my front door with the authority of a sheriff in an old Western film. She held up a piece of paper like it was an official warrant. "You've been issued a violation," she announced, her voice dripping with smugness. I took the paper and read it. Unauthorized fence modification? I didn't even have a fence. She tapped her clipboard. The HOA guidelines clearly state that any exterior changes must be pre-approved. I folded my arms. That would be valid if I were part of the HOA. Karen's eyes twitched. Well, this is a community and we have standards. I handed the violation back to her. And I don't answer to those standards. That should have been the end of it. But Karen didn't take no for an answer. A few days later, another violation showed up in my mailbox. This time it was for the color of my front door. Apparently, it wasn't neutral enough. I stared at the paper in disbelief. My door was beige. Beige. I confronted her while she was inspecting someone else's lawn with a tape measure. "Karen, you can't keep sending me these fake notices. You're not in charge of my house." She crossed her arms. "Actually, I am." "Oh. What law gives you that power?" She huffed. "It's about maintaining property values. You're bringing down the neighborhood with your..." She gestured vaguely at my house. Asterisk choices star dot. I took a slow breath. "Karen, my house is literally the same style and color as half the street." She squinted at me. "That's not the point." It got worse. A few mornings later, I caught her standing in my driveway, staring at my mailbox with pure disgust. I opened the door. "Karen, what now?" She pointed dramatically. "Your mailbox is non-compliant." I glanced at it. Same basic black mailbox as everyone else's. "How?" She pulled out her phone and took pictures. "It's slightly leaning." I stared at her. "It's been that way since I moved in." She nodded like I had just confessed to a crime. "Exactly." I sighed. "Karen, go home." He did not go home. She doubled down. Within days, I had a fresh set of bogus violations stacked up. My porch light was too bright. My recycling bin was left out 2 minutes past pickup time. My wind chimes worked too loud. Then she crossed a line. I woke up one morning to find a huge neon-colored sign planted in my front yard. In big bold letters it read, "Warning, non-compliant property." I stood there, mouth open. She had gone full dictator. Marching straight to her house, I knocked hard on her door. She opened it, smug as ever. "You think this is funny?" I held up the sign. She tilted her head. "It's a courtesy warning. If you fix the issues, I'll consider having it removed." I laughed because what else could I do? "Karen, you don't have the authority to put signs on my property." She smiled. "Actually, I do." That's when I realized. Karen wasn't going to stop. She wasn't just on a power trip, she needed control. And the more I resisted, the harder she pushed. Fine. She wanted a war, I was ready. At first, I tried to handle it the mature way. I figured if I ignored Karen's nonsense long enough, she'd get bored and move on. Spoiler alert, she didn't. If anything, my refusal to bow down only made her double down. After the giant non-compliant property sign incident, I started receiving letters. Actual printed letters, stuffed in my mailbox. Karen had gone full bureaucrat. Each letter was formatted like an official HOA violation, complete with bullet points, threats of fines, and her signature at the bottom. The best part? The return address was just her house. I knew she had no real power over me, but I also knew that logic didn't work on people like Karen. So, if she wanted to play games, I'd play right back. Just in a way that kept me firmly on the side of legal and hilarious. The first thing I did was make a few adjustments to my property. Subtle enough to be legal but enough to make her blood pressure spike. First, I bought a dozen more garden gnomes. Not just any gnomes, ridiculously colorful, over-the-top ones. Some had sunglasses, some rode tiny scooters, and one held up a sign that said, "Karen approved," with a big thumbs up. The day she saw them, I thought she was going to combust. She stood in my yard, jaw clenched, scribbling furiously on her clipboard like she was preparing a lawsuit against my lawn ornaments. "You're being childish," she snapped. I grinned. "But are they against any rules?" Her eye twitched. "They're distasteful." "Ah," I nodded. "But not illegal." Checkmate. But I wasn't done. Next, I bought a motion-activated speaker and set it up near my front door. Every time someone walked by, it played a pre-recorded message. "This property is not part of the HOA. Please enjoy your day." Karen was livid. She stormed up my driveway, wagging a finger. "That's harassment." I held up my hands. "It's just an informational message." "You're mocking me." "Only if you think it applies to you." Her face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. Then came my personal favorite move, filing my own complaints. Since she loved writing fake violations, I figured she'd appreciate getting a few of her own. I started documenting every single time she broke an actual city ordinance. Parking too close to a stop sign? Reported. Letting her trash bins sit out for an extra day? Filed a complaint. Blocking a sidewalk while lecturing a neighbor? Oh, you bet I took a picture. It turns out that Karen had plenty of violations of her own. And unlike her bogus HOA rules, these were real enforceable laws. The final straw? I attended a city council meeting and asked if non-HOA properties could be forced to comply with HOA rules. The answer was, of course, a firm no. But the best part? The council made it clear that harassment from an HOA board member could be grounds for legal action. So, at the next neighborhood meeting, I made sure to casually bring it up. Karen's face? Priceless. She huffed and puffed but realized she'd pushed too far. The HOA board, already annoyed with her antics, started keeping a closer eye on her. And just like that, her iron grip on the neighborhood started to slip. But Karen wasn't one to go down quietly. Oh no. She was about to take things to a whole new level of crazy. At first, it seemed like I was the only one dealing with Karen's nonsense. But as soon as I started pushing back, something interesting happened. The neighbors started talking. And once the floodgates opened, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was leading a quiet rebellion. It started with Tom from next door. One evening as I was watering my lawn, he strolled over, hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said, glancing around like he was about to share classified information. "I saw what you did with the gnomes. That was impressive." I chuckled. "Just trying to brighten up the neighborhood." He lowered his voice. "Karen once sent me a violation for having excessive Halloween decorations. I had 2 pumpkins. 2. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. Word spread fast. Within days, more neighbors started sharing their own Karen horror stories. The Johnsons got a complaint about their car being too loud, even though it was a hybrid. Mrs. Patel got a warning for her non-regulation flower beds, which had been there for 10 years before Karen even moved in. Someone, no one could prove it but we all knew, found their holiday lights mysteriously cut just days after Karen complained about them. Karen had been ruling the neighborhood like a tiny suburban dictator, and until now no one had dared to push back. But once they saw me openly defying her, people started getting bold. The first act of defiance came from old Mr. Rodriguez down the street. One morning he put up a giant flashing neon sign in his front yard. Read, "Live, Laugh, Lawn," the most aggressively cheerful thing you could imagine. Karen nearly lost her mind. She stomped up to his house, ranting about how it didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. Mr. Rodriguez, bless him, just nodded along and said, "Oh, I didn't realize we lived in a dictatorship." The next day more people joined in. Tom installed a second mailbox, right next to his regular one, just to be petty. When Karen tried to call it an unapproved structure, he pointed out that she had 2 birdhouses in her yard. Mrs. Patel started baking cookies and handing them out with a little note, "From my non-compliant kitchen." Then someone, I still don't know who, snuck onto Karen's property in the middle of the night and placed a single pink flamingo in her yard. Just one. No note. No explanation. A silent protest. Karen predictably exploded. She went door to door demanding to know who was defiling the neighborhood. But no one cracked. Instead, more flamingos started appearing. One in the Johnsons' yard, one on Tom's porch, one in front of my mailbox. It became a movement. The Flamingo Rebellion. Karen tried to fight back, filing complaints left and right. But the thing was, none of it stuck. We all knew the actual neighborhood regulations now. We'd read the city codes. We weren't breaking any real rules, just her made-up ones. She was losing control and she knew it. Her last-ditch effort? Calling an emergency HOA meeting. But that didn't go quite how she planned. Because by then we were ready. And Karen? She was about to get a taste of her own medicine. Karen was unraveling. She had spent so much time controlling the neighborhood that she never considered what would happen if the neighborhood turned against her. And now it was happening fast. The Flamingo Rebellion had taken on a life of its own. Every time she tried to remove one, another would appear somewhere else. She was spending more time patrolling for plastic birds than writing her usual complaint letters. But she was not done fighting. Her first move was to escalate her fake violations. She started slipping notices under doors at night, hoping to scare people into compliance. But the neighbors were ready. They had started comparing her notes and quickly realized she was making things up as she went. Tom, the neighbor who had been fined for having an excessively blue car, went straight to the HOA board with a stack of her ridiculous notices. The Johnsons followed, bringing proof that Karen had fined them for a recycling bin being out when it was actually trash day. Then came the trespassing incident. Karen, in her desperation to prove she was right, decided to take things one step further. One morning I caught her in my yard, measuring my grass with a ruler. Not just looking at it. Physically squatting down and pressing a ruler into the lawn like some kind of forensic investigator. I stepped onto my porch, arms crossed. "Karen, what exactly are you doing?" She barely looked up. "Your grass is over the acceptable height limit." I stared at her. "Acceptable to who?" She huffed. "The HOA has strict guidelines." I reminded her once again that I was not part of the HOA. That my grass was city-approved and well within the legal limit. But Karen just shook her head. "It is about the community's image." That was it. I had been patient, I had played nice, and I had even had a little fun at her expense. But now she was on my property breaking real laws. I took out my phone and started recording. Karen stood up fast. "What are you doing?" "Documenting this for the city." "Trespassing is illegal, Karen." She blanched. "I am not trespassing. I am enforcing rules. You are on my property. You do not have permission." He sputtered. Then, realizing how bad it looked, she stormed off. That video made its way around the neighborhood within hours. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the board had been bombarded with complaints. People who had once been too afraid to challenge Karen were now stepping forward with their own stories, their own proof of her harassment. When Karen walked into the meeting, she expected to be running the show. Instead, she was faced with a room full of people waiting for her to answer for her actions. The HOA president, an older woman who had tolerated Karen's antics for too long, wasted no time. "Karen, we have received numerous complaints about your behavior. You have been issuing violations outside of HOA authority. You have been harassing homeowners. And now we have proof that you trespassed on private property." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the HOA president held up a hand. "Enough. We have reviewed the bylaws. You have overstepped your position. Effective immediately, you are removed from the HOA board." Silence. Then a few scattered claps. Then full-blown applause. Karen's face went red. She tried to argue, but it was over. The board had made their decision and the neighborhood was done with her. And just like that, Karen lost everything she had worked so hard to control. But she was not finished just yet. Because if she could not run the HOA, she had one last move left. She was going to make a dramatic exit. Karen was finished and she knew it. Getting kicked off the HOA board wasn't just a loss. It was humiliating. She had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, acting like she was the ultimate authority, and now? She was just another homeowner. For a few days, we all expected some kind of retaliation. Maybe another round of passive-aggressive notes. Maybe a last-ditch attempt to find someone for breathing too loudly on their porch. But surprisingly, she went quiet. Too quiet. Then the "for sale" sign appeared in her yard. At first we thought it was a joke. But no, it was real. Karen had lost her grip on power, and instead of living among the people who had rebelled against her, she decided to pack up and leave. But karma wasn't done with her just yet. First, we found out why she was selling so suddenly. Turns out, all those violations she had been handing out over the years, she had been ignoring some of the real ones on her own property. Her fence, not up to code. Her shed, built without a permit. Her landscaping, overgrown and technically in violation of actual city regulations. And the best part? The HO fined her. Yes. The very organization she had used as a weapon against the neighborhood finally turned against her. Because once she was no longer on the board, she wasn't exempt from the real rules. And it got even better. The house sat on the market for weeks. Then months. No one wanted to buy the home of the most infamous HOA tyrant in town. One day Tom, my neighbor and my partner in crime against Karen, called me over trying to contain his laughter. "You're gonna love this," he said, pointing at a moving truck in Karen's driveway. We watched as a new family pulled up, waving happily at the neighbors as they stepped out of their car. They seemed nice. Then we saw what they were unloading. Flamingo. Not just any flamingo. A 6-foot-tall, neon-pink, solar-powered, light-up flamingo. The whole neighborhood stood outside watching as Karen saw it. Her face turned a shade of red I didn't think was possible for a human being. She muttered something under her breath, climbed into her car and peeled out of the driveway for the last time. The neighborhood had won. Karen was gone. And in her place? A family that immediately fit right in. A few days later, the new homeowners threw a block party. Everyone was invited. There was food, music, and for the grand finale, someone handed out tiny pink plastic flamingos as party favors. I stood in my yard looking at the peaceful street, the smiling neighbors, and the total absence of one clipboard-wielding nightmare. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood actually felt like a community. And as I planted my own little flamingo by my mailbox, I couldn't help but grin. Karen was finally gone. The grass grew freely, the mailboxes stood proudly, and we all learned a valuable lesson. Never mess with the flamingo rebellion. Life in the neighborhood felt different, lighter. Without Karen lurking around with her clipboard, people actually started enjoying their homes again. The Johnsons put up their holiday decorations early that year. Extra lights just because they could. Tom finally painted his front door a bold blue, and no one wrote him a single complaint. Mrs. Patel planted new flowers, every color imaginable, and the HOA? They didn't say a word. The new family that moved into Karen's house fit in perfectly. Not only did they keep the giant neon flamingo, but they also added a second one, with a sombrero. The entire street saw it as a symbol of victory. I even got a letter from the actual HOA president. Not a complaint, just a simple note that said, "We're so sorry you had to deal with her. Enjoy your freedom." And oh, I did. No more ridiculous violations. No more surprise fines in my mailbox. No more standing in my driveway trying to reason with someone who thought a mailbox could ruin property values. The best part? The neighborhood finally felt like a community again. People waved, chatted, and helped each other out instead of living in fear of a woman with too much time on her hands. One evening, as I sat on my porch sipping a drink, Tom walked over, nodding toward the spot where Karen's non-compliant property sign once stood. "Feels good, huh?" he said. I smirked. "Better than good." He chuckled. "So, what's next? You gonna start a real HOA rebellion?" I laughed. "No. I think the flamingos said enough." And with that we went back to enjoying what we had fought so hard for, a peaceful, Karen-free neighborhood.